नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय जन्माद्यस्य यतोऽन्वयादितरतश्च अर्थेषु अभिज्ञस्वराट् तेने ब्रह्महृदाय आदिकवये मुह्यन्ति यत्सूरयः तेजो वारिमृदां यथा विनिमयो यत्र त्रिसर्गो मृषा धाम्ना स्वेन सदा निरस्तकुहकं सत्यं परं धीमहि निगमकल्पतरोर्गलितं फलं शुकमुखादमृतद्रवसंयुतं पिबत भागवतं रसमालयं मुहुरहो रसिका भुवि भावुकाः. So now we are entering the 17th chapter of the 6th Skandha of Srimad Bhagavatam. This is the concluding chapter of the story of Chitraketu, which will connect to Vrtra. So, as we may remember, the story of Chitraketu was related because of the question about Vrtra. We saw the great demon Vrtra who fought with Indra, and he was not only valiant, but he was completely surrendered. And to Indra, he uttered the greatest words of wisdom, and then he addressed the most sublime prayer to the Supreme Lord, asking for only unconditional love and asking to be the servant of the Supreme Lord as he was facing death in the battlefield. So this caused wonder in Parikshit as to how come a demon had such unflinching and unconditional love and devotion. So Shuka Brahma Rishi started relating the story of Chitraketu, and now he will tie the two together. So what happened was, after Chitraketu was blessed by the Lord, as we saw in the last chapter, where he, by the grace of Narada, uttered this prayer with complete focus, and thereby got the vision of the Supreme Lord in the form of Sankarshana or Ananta, and he got the blessings of Lord Ananta, which is the expansion of Lord Sri Hari, who is Balaram as well. And therefore, getting the blessings of Lord Ananta, Chitraketu went about as Vidyadhara, and he was having many mystical powers by now, and he was also endowed with an aerial vehicle in which he was going around as a yogi, as someone who was living with mystical powers, and yet he had not completely attained perfection. The Lord had blessed him that by fully surrendering unto me, you shall attain perfection. And so he was very devoted to the Supreme Lord, and yet he had a small hint of ego left in him. So one occasion it is said that he was flying in his resplendent aerial car by Mount Kailasa, and he saw Lord Shiva there sitting under a banyan tree and teaching the various siddhas and rishis. So we always see Lord Shiva in this way, even in the chapter on Daksha. After that, when Brahma comes to see Shiva to get his blessings in order to reinstate Daksha, at the time also Brahma finds him sitting surrounded by Narada and the great rishis and expounding on self-knowledge. Here also, that's exactly what Shiva is doing. That's why Shiva is always called the Adi Guru, and he is the form of Dakshinamurti who always gives the wisdom. He is therefore the one who also has the river of Ganga, which also symbolizes knowledge coming from his matted locks from his head. So Shiva, thus the Jagat Guru, the Adi Guru as it is said, Sadashiva, he was there sitting and giving teachings to the various siddhas and rishis. And interestingly, this time he had in his lap the divine Mother Parvati, his spouse, seated on his lap. So this was all part of a Leela, which we will see. So we see even in some deities, the Mother Parvati sitting on the lap of Shiva, and similarly Mother Lakshmi sitting on the lap of Narasimha, and so on. Here also, it is said that Goddess Parvati was sitting on his lap and his arm around her. And seeing this, Chitraketu, he was going there by the aerial vehicle, so it is said that he descended there. He saw this scene, and then because he had this small hint of still ego left in him, he made a comment which was not very appropriate. He said, "Oh, look at this. Here is Shiva, who is the guru of the whole universe." He actually glorifies Shiva first. He says he is the guru of the whole universe, and he is teaching the very essence of dharma to all the great sages. And yet, look at him. He has got his consort embraced in his arms in open assembly. So, this is inappropriate for Chitraketu to say. So, he says, Esha Lokaguruhu Sakshat Dharmam Vakta Sharirinam Aste Mukhya Sabhayam Vai Maituni Bhuya Bharyaya. So, he says he is holding his Bharya, that is his consort Parvati, in his embrace in the Sabha, in the assembly. This is not appropriate at all. He says he is wearing matted locks, he practices austerities, he speaks about the Supreme Brahman, and yet he is hugging a woman in open assembly. So, this is again, he is indulging in such insulting language because of the slight imperfection still left in him. He says, Jatadhara Tivratapa Brahmavadi Sabhapatihi Ankikritya Striyam Chaste Gathnim Prakrite Yata. So he is first again, he is not insulting Shiva, for example, the way Daksha insulted. If you remember that incident where Daksha wanted to humiliate Shiva and insulted him, and because of that, he had to face great punishment. Here, Chitraketu is still glorifying Shiva. He says, Jatadharaha, one who's got matted locks, Tivra Tapa, one who performs severe austerities, Brahmavadi, he is always expounding on Brahma, and he is Sabhapati. Sabhapati means he is the head of the assembly. In fact, the Lord Shiva in the famous temple of Chidambaram is always called as Sabhapati, because that's one of the names of Shiva, the head of the assembly. He heads all the assemblies of rishis and so on, as we saw, and teaching them, giving them the highest teaching of Brahman. So he says all that, Jatadhara, Tivratapa, Brahmavadi, Sabhapati, and says, yet how come he is hugging his consort in public assembly? Even regular people embrace their woman only in seclusion. Why is he doing this in open assembly? So here again, Chitraketu is expressing an inappropriate way of speaking to a great being such as Lord Shiva without knowing the heart of Lord Shiva. And yet it is all part of a Leela, as we will see, because this is what enables Chitraketu to be completely liberated. So Shuka Brahma Rishi says, hearing these remarks, Shiva was completely unaffected. Even in Daksha's case, we saw when Daksha was speaking in very humiliating way, Shiva remained unmoved, ever peaceful in his own self. And later, only when his consort Sati, who went to Daksha, and she was humiliated and thereby she gave up her body. After that, Shiva's manifestation as Virabhadra destroyed the Daksha Yajna and all that happened. But Shiva himself was unaffected. And here also, Shiva is of course completely unaffected. He remains quiet. It says, Bhagavan api tachrutva prahasya gadadhir nripa. So, tushni bhabuva. He was simply silent. Bhagavan Shiva remained completely silent. And Chitraketu, who was ignorant of Shiva's greatness, uttered something that was unbecoming of him, as it said. And therefore, goddess Parvati, who was there, again, she spoke to Chitraketu. So even in the Daksha's case, it was the mother as Sati who was further humiliated by Daksha, and because of which she cursed Daksha and she dropped her body. And then, of course, we saw there mentioned that she was born in the Himalayas, in the Parvat, and she became therefore Parvati, and she reunited with Shiva. And so now it is Parvati, the Sati, who has reunited with Shiva, who is sitting with Shiva here. And so she tells Chitraketu, she says, who is this fellow? Does he think he is ruling the world and competent enough to even disrespect a great being like Lord Shiva? Because she says, even Brahma, even sons of Brahma such as Narada or Bhrigu, Sanat Kumara, Lord Kapila, Manu, all the great beings, none of them ever speak in this way to Shiva. So it looks like he is the one who is now the great paragon of righteousness. So she is speaking in a very sarcastic way that it looks like this Chitraketu has suddenly become the paragon of righteousness, exceeding Brahma and Kapila and all the great beings, Sanat Kumara and so on. And therefore then she turns angrily and says, this fellow deserves to be punished because he has insulted the great Lord Shiva, whose lotus feet are worthy of being adored and who is the most auspicious of the auspicious. She says, Padambuja Yugmam Jagadgurum Mangala Mangalam Swayam. That's the nature of Shiva. Mangala Mangalam. He is auspicious among the auspicious. Jagadguru, he is the teacher of the universe. Padambuja Yugmam, whose feet are meant to be adored. Such a great Shiva this fellow has insulted, therefore he deserves to be punished. And so she says, this arrogant fellow does not deserve to be at the sole of the feet of the Supreme Lord Vishnu. So he is known as a devotee of the Supreme Lord, as we already saw. He got the blessing of the vision of Lord Sankarsana, Ananta, and he's got mystic powers, and therefore he is known as a devotee of the Supreme Lord, and yet he did something which is not deserving of that. So she says, Na ayam arhati Vaikunta pada mula upasarpanam. So he does not deserve to serve the lotus feet of the Lord of Vaikunta, which is the Supreme Being Hari. Therefore she says, may he be reborn among the demons and learn a lesson. So this is the curse she gives. So now we can see how Vrtra is connected to Chitraketu. So this great Chitraketu, who of course went through, was a very pious king and who ruled very piously, and yet he had a desire for a son, because of which he fell into grief tremendously. Then he was saved from the grief by Narada. Then he did great tapas and he got the blessing of the Lord, and he was liberated of all his attachments, and he was in the mood of devotion to the Supreme Being, and yet he had a slight sense of ego left in him, which had to be removed, and therefore that ego expressed itself as an insult to Lord Shiva, and the Mother Parvati therefore tells him, you have to go do this. And she addresses him finally, of course, as son. She says, Yataiha bhuyo mahatam nakarta putra kilbisham. She says, O putra, O my son, you have yet to learn one important lesson. Therefore, you be born as a demon and thereby learn this lesson. So, even the curse of Mother Parvati is only a blessing. And so she tells him to be born as a demon. So hearing this, Chitraketu instantly recognizes his folly. He comes down and he falls at the feet of the Mother Parvati along with Shiva next to her. And now he speaks great words of wisdom, because he just had that one small flaw in him which required this event to correct. So many times we see this happen, that even great beings, they may have one small flaw, and it is a great blessing when that flaw manifests in the front of people who are as great in this case as Shiva and Parvati, because that instantly, instead of falling down further, he was able to instantly recognize his folly and he took it as a blessing, and thereby he was able to now completely be surrendered as the demon Vrtra. So he says here, I accept your curse with both my palms joined together, because whatever is pronounced by the great divinities like you are already preordained. So he says, this is all preordained, and only you are saying that which is preordained, so I cannot hold you responsible. And then he says, only through ignorance an embodied soul experiences joy and sorrow, and therefore one cannot be held responsible for joy and sorrow. It is the ignorance which makes the fool identify with his mind and his ego and thereby experience joy and sorrow. He says, Naiva Atma na paraschapi karta syat sukadukhayoho kartaram manyate apragya atmanam paramevacha. He speaks beautiful words of wisdom now that he has been chastised and he has learned this lesson. He says, one is never the actual doer of any actions, but because of false identification, due to ignorance, he says, Kartaram manyate apragnya, because of not situated in wisdom, one identifies with the modes of nature. And in this case, for example, he identified with this thought of insulting Shiva. And so, any identification with any thought and then going with that as I and mine causes one to go through joy and sorrow. Therefore, nobody is responsible for this except ignorance itself. So, in this world of matter, therefore, he says, what is the difference finally between a curse and a blessing? Heaven and hell, joy and sorrow, all of these are finally only the same ultimately from the perspective of the Supreme Being. So he says, the one Lord who brings forth all the living beings by his own Maya, he only ordains bondage, he ordains liberation, he ordains happiness and misery, and therefore everything happens according to his will. So this is again a very beautiful verse. He says, Guna pravaha etasmin kaha shapaha ko anugraha. What is shapa? What is a curse? What is blessing? Kaha swargaha, kaha narakaha. What is heaven? What is hell? What is pleasure? What is pain? All of these are ultimately the same. He says, Ekaha srijati bhutani bhagavan atma mayaya yesham bandham cha moksham cha sukham dukkham cha nishkalaha. He says, everything, bandham moksham, that is bondage and liberation, pleasure and pain, all of this are as preordained, ultimately speaking, because the Lord brings forth everyone by his own Maya, and all this is applied to him, for to whom everything is alike, everyone is alike. He is free from any attachment, and he has no sense of either relation or kinsman or adversary. Everything is alike. This being the case, where is the need for me to get affected by any of this? Because when one is surrendered to the Supreme Lord, then one recognizes that everything happens according to his will, the energy of Maya, as he says here. And therefore, I accept whatever you say. I know that whatever action comes forth is only for the welfare, and therefore, since you have mentioned this, I accept it as a blessing. So, thereby, he takes the right attitude towards Parvati and Shiva, unlike again Daksha, who was so lost in ego. Here, Chitraketu only had a small modicum of ego, and that was immediately removed by his one wrong act and the punishment given by Parvati. So, after this, offering his respect to Parvati and Shiva and expressing again the glorification of the Supreme Lord as the ordainer of all events, including this particular event, and therefore accepting it with equanimity and not holding himself responsible, not holding Parvati responsible, but saying that everything happens ultimately only by his will, and therefore this also has to be accepted, and I accept it as a blessing. And thereby, having pleased Lord Shiva and Parvati by his word, Chitraketu went away. And then Lord Shiva addresses Parvati in very sweet tones. He says that, see, you cursed him, but you can see that he is a pure devotee of the Lord, and therefore he was free from any attachment to anything else, and this was the only thing he did. But he is so pure that he was able to accept it equanimously, because devotees of the Lord, he says, they do not find any difference between heaven and hell, as we already saw. The same thing Shiva says here, Narayana paraha sarve na kutaschana bibhyati. He says the devotees of Lord Narayana do not fear anything. It is only the Maya of the Lord that souls are invested with a body, and because of that they go through pairs of opposites, desirable and undesirable, pleasure and pain, and so on. But those who are completely surrendered to the Supreme Being, they are endowed with wisdom and dispassion, and therefore they are not affected by anything in this world. He says, Vasudeve Bhagavati Bhakti Udahrutam Nranam Jnana Vairagya Viryanam Na Iha Kaschid Vyapashrayah. Those who are devoted to the Supreme Lord Vasudeva, they do not get affected by anything because they are steeped in jnana and vairagya, wisdom and dispassion. So again we see how beautifully Shiva glorifies the Supreme Lord and how he is expounding the highest wisdom in this way, by saying that it is all the will of the Supreme Being that makes everything happen, and nobody can know his will. None is dear or hateful to him, none is his own or alien. He is the self of all beings, and he is the Supreme Lord Hari. He says, Nahi asya asti priyaha kaschana apriyaha. There is no one dear or not dear. Swaha paropiva. There is no one who is own or alien. Atmatvat sarvabhutanam sarvabhuta priyo harihi. Because the Supreme Lord is the self of all beings, and therefore every being is equally dear to the Supreme Lord. So he says this highly blessed Chitraketu is his beloved devotee, and therefore he also has this eye of sameness. He is tranquil, and therefore it is no wonder that he was able to instantly correct himself and accept this curse, because it's no ordinary matter that someone like Chitraketu, as we can see, who has achieved so much through his tapas, who is a great yogi, who is flying around in an aerial car, and who's got a direct vision of the Supreme Lord, and all he had was one small fault in that moment that came out. And it is said, Shukha Brahmarishi says, he had all the yogic powers in him to get rid of that curse, and yet he did not use any of the yogic powers, because he realized that that act of his was inappropriate in a moment of momentary lapse of reason, and therefore he voluntarily accepted it completely, and he accepted the curse of Mother Parvati as a blessing. So this is the greatness of the one surrendered to the Lord, Shiva also says. And therefore it is said that this Chitraketu, accepting this, he therefore was the one who was born as Vrtra. So when the deity Twashta did this yajna after the Vishwarupa, we saw Vishwarupa was killed by Indra. After that, Twashta did this yajna, and out of the sacrificial fire, he wanted to bring out a demoniac being to take revenge on Indra. So Chitraketu was destined to be that demoniac being, Vrtra. So Chitraketu took birth as Vrtra, and we saw how he therefore did his dharma by fighting with the devas and fighting valiantly, and yet because he is a completely surrendered devotee of the Lord, and now he was perfected after this curse was given, he, even though in a demoniac body, was completely surrendered, and he expressed that surrender so beautifully by expressing his desire to only behold the Lord, as he said very evocatively, just as a young bird desires to behold the mother bird, or the calf desires to behold the mother cow and get the milk, or the beloved wife yearns to see her husband gone away. I only yearn to see the Lord. So he is now, we can see here how he had the vision of the Lord, just as the young bird who has been with the mother and the mother is gone away, or the wife who has been with the husband and the husband gone away. Similarly, he had the vision of the Lord and now he has been separated. And with this separation, his intense love has only increased, and he accepted this curse calmly. He was born as Vrtra, and he lived inwardly in this mood of separation and unconditional surrender to the Lord, while outwardly engaging in his activities as Vrtra. And therefore, at the moment of death, he expressed his heart with such love and such emotion and said, I only long to behold my Lord. And with that intent, he died in the battlefield. And as we saw, how the light of his own being, Atma Jyoti, merged with Bhagavan and he was completely liberated. So, this is the story of how Chitraketu, with all this story behind him, became a devotee and then was born as Vrtra and attained complete loving devotion and the eternal abode of the Supreme Lord. With this chapter ends. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.